What's up, folks? Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise. My name is Trevi, and I'm here today to talk to you about some Tyranids. It has been a ridiculously long time since the last time I did a Tyranid unit ranking, and so much has changed in the game since that last video. In terms of Tyranids specifically, I mean, we've been through two batteries of erratas that have changed the faction. They've been repointed twice. Munitorum Field Manual had a bunch of changes. Obviously, the metagame is totally different. And given that, in the May FAQ, we just saw some changes to Tyranids. I think this is right now the longest period between when we get a change to the next change that's going to happen to the faction, at least the next transformative change. So I figured that this was the perfect time to revisit the Tyranid unit ranking. So let's get into it. First off, I want to touch on the criteria for each of the tiers. Now, obviously, these are pretty arbitrary, you know, S, A, B, C, D. I thought about renaming these in my little tier maker here, but I figured everyone uses these ranking tiers to compare units across factions, so it wouldn't really make sense to change them. But generally speaking, the way that I'm going to be approaching these is S tier units are going to be the big money makers of your list. These are units where, looking back on a game, you can kind of put the game on the shoulders of that unit and they'll carry you through to victory. You know, the units that do the most damage, that score the most points, that have the most utility are going to be an S tier. A tier is going to be faction staples, so things that will probably win you games just by virtue of being in your list, but aren't necessarily required and don't necessarily do a ton of damage. So things like troop options, very efficient objective holders, stuff like that aren't necessarily very flashy. B tier stuff is going to be things that are competitively viable, but not necessarily in and of themselves hyper powerful. So with a little bit of help, they can be very powerful and very strong options, but they're not required for every list. That's basically going to be our midpoint of the rankings. C tier options are going to be sort of the same thing, but require additional support to be made effective. These are units that you can include if you want a little bit of flair, but generally speaking, they're going to require more work to make effective than you'll get out of them. D tier units are just going to be basically stone unplayable. They have big, huge problems with the unit, and they just don't really function in an army. So D tier units are the ones that I would 100% avoid. So with that out of the way, let's just jump into this Tyranid unit ranking. We're going to be talking about every single Tyranid unit between the Codex and the Imperial Armor Compendium. Also, like and subscribe if you like Tyranids. We talk about Tyranids all the time on the channel, so if you're new here and you like the Buggy Boys, stay a while. All right, starting at the top here, this is in no particular order. We have the Malanthrope. This poor guy's a little cut off because he's so tall and skinny, but I'm going to go ahead and put the Malanthrope, I think, down here in C tier. Malanthropes have been a staple in Tyranid lists for a long time. The ability to provide -1 to hit to a wide swath of your army while being character protected so they can't remove that unit is good. The downside is that Malanthrop takes up an HQ slot, which is one of the most important slots in a Tyranid detachment. And the Spore Clouds mechanic doesn't really work as well as it did in 8th edition. Not only does it not cross between high fleets, and generally speaking, when you're building a Tyranid list, you're going to want a high fleet Kronos detachment in addition to the detachment of another high fleet that can support your melee troops a little bit better, which means that any of the Spore Cloud units are only going to be affecting half your army, which is not worth the cost. In addition, because -1 effects don't stack anymore, you'll actually find that -1 to hit doesn't really do that much these days. Many times you're going to be putting your opponent in a position where they're already suffering -1 to hit, which means that the Spore Cloud effect doesn't do anything. So really too bad for the Malanthrope. I don't think it's that bad of a unit archetype. It just doesn't work currently in the way Tyranids are built and the way 9th edition functions. Moving on to Gargoyles, we're starting off with a little bit of a tepid start here. They're so close to being good, but I do think that I'm going to put them down in sort of bottom C tier here. I don't think that they're quite broken enough in a bad way to put them at the bottom of the list, and especially because they're a high move fly infantry, which is a really powerful unit archetype to be. The downside is that they're fast attack, which doesn't really have any particular support. They don't have objective secured. They don't fill up slots in your detachment that you need to be filling up. And if you're trying to use them to perform actions or score secondary objectives like engage in all fronts that are a little bit more maneuver oriented, there are just better options in the faction that totally supersede Gargoyles. It's really too bad because I think this unit is like so close to playable. I think if they got a points drop, if we saw Gargoyles drop to basically the same cost as a Gant, so that they would compete directly with bringing additional Termagants, then I think maybe there's an argument to be made there. The trade-off between being a troops choice and having OBSEC or having wings and fly is like a really interesting dichotomy. The downside is that Gargoyles just cost so much that it's almost never worth bringing them over the troops option to fill that same role. So too bad for Gargoyles. I do think that there is a universe where a couple of rules improvements in the future, Gargoyles are actually really good. I do have like 30 of them sitting in a drawer somewhere that I have never seen the table, and I'm excited to play. The models are really cool. They're really big, which is a downside because they can be seen really easily, but man, their wings are like sort of gorgeously sculpted and they look really good on the table. Moving on to the Mawloc. This is going to be our first entry into the B tier here. They aren't that good of a unit, but they do some things that are pretty interesting. First off, their ability to come out of Deep Strike basically any distance away from enemies means that there is the potential that they are good secondary objective scorers, especially for things like Engage on All Fronts or Line Breaker that require you to be dropping into an area of the table that's usually going to be screened out by your opponent, and Mawloc's being relatively unscreenable makes that pretty good for them. The downside is that outside of the mortal wounds that they're dealing when they're coming out of Deep Strike, Mawlocs aren't really doing any damage to your opponent's army. They don't have a good melee profile to speak of. And even if you're trying to get mortal wounds out of these guys, they're going to be bleeding you CP using Unexpected Incursion to deal additional damage with their Terror from the Deep ability. So it's an expensive unit for one that's essentially combat ineffective. And on top of that, it's also a monster with 12 wounds, which means it gives up 2 points for Bring It Down. So if you're bringing a lot of monsters in your list, your opponent can capitalize on that. And Mawlocs are sort of comedically easy to kill, so your opponent's going to be able to grab 2 points off killing that relatively quickly. Now, if you don't have a lot of monsters in your list, it's not that big of a deal because your opponent's not going to be incentivized to Bring It Down to begin with. So the trade-off is fine, but it does restrict your list building options. That said, I do think Mawlocs, they have a place. A lot of lists have used them effectively, and certainly dropping into your opponent's deployment zone, and certainly dropping into screened areas of the table to grab those maneuver-style secondaries is a unique role to fill in the Tyranid faction that you can't really find anywhere else. All right, I've rearranged our Trygons a little bit here. We're going to talk about the standard Trygon next. This one is going to be the standard Trygon. I've decided this is the Trygon Prime. Now looking at it, I actually don't know which one's supposed to be which, so we're just going to make an arbitrary decision. Let's talk about the Trygon. I think a Trygon ends up somewhere in C tier here, somewhere maybe at the top. There are some upsides to taking Trygons. They are fast, they hit pretty hard, especially if you upgrade them with adaptive physiologies. Murderous Eyes on these things can make them, pretty decent in melee. And the ability to come out of Deep Strike. They have a gun. They can pull other units in with them. Those are all good things. Now, whether or not they're particularly playable things, that's another issue. I think Trygon suffers from basically all of the downsides of the Mawloc, but without the upsides of being able to score you secondary objectives really easily. And if you're just dropping them on the table, being a non-fly monster means they're going to have to, move around terrain. So despite the fact that they have a relatively reasonable movement of 9 inches, with access to Hive Commander, with access to Onslaught, all of these things that you can use to buff that, they probably still take a turn to get to your opponent, and at only toughness 6, no invulnerable save, just a 3+ armor save protecting them, they're probably going to die on the way in. So the Trygon profile is not terrible, but unfortunately, just their delivery mechanism is not very good. With that, we'll talk about the Trygon Prime next. This is, I think, going to be our first inclusion in the D tier here. The biggest downside of the Trygon Prime is that it costs extra points over top that of a regular Trygon. And while it has some interesting keywords in addition to what the Trygon has, it's also a character, which has its own upsides and downsides. It can be given a Warlord trait and a Relic and all that stuff, be upgraded like any of your other characters, although that said, Tyranids don't really usually do that. But, we're not Space Marines spending CP to add additional Warlord traits to stuff. Our Warlord traits are terrible, and we're sacrificing them for adaptive physiologies anyway. And it also gives up Assassinate when you kill it. So it's worth an extra point over top of the normal points it would be giving up for Bring It Down. So in the comparison between a standard Trygon and a Trygon Prime, I don't think there's really ever any reason you take a Trygon Prime. The one upside I see of the Trygon Prime is the ability to take an Arachnocyte gland, so they can actually make charges fairly reliably out of Deep Strike, but again, that's costing you 1 to 2 CP depending on how many other relics you have in your army, and you're spending those resources to buff a unit that's probably suboptimal to begin with, and then also gives your opponent a bunch of VPs for free. So definitely steer clear of basically Trygons in general, but especially the Trygon Prime. Now with that, we're going to move to basically the totally polar opposite of the spectrum, because the next unit is going to be the Swarmlord, and this is probably our number one pick up in the top here. Spoiler alert for everyone who was waiting to see what I think the best unit in the Codex is, and it's the Swarmlord. Post-May FAQ, especially, the Swarmlord is just so incredibly efficient. He dropped 30 points in that FAQ, going from 270 down to 240. It does make Swarmlord's comparison to a lot of other Smash characters like a little bit more palatable. When you consider Swarmlord as two separate components in your army, not only as your preeminent force multiplier with the ability to deliver anything in your army into melee basically wherever you want it, or to hit and run using psychic powers, for example, or just move around the table and get secondary objectives. That ability is incredible and worth, 100 to 150 points by itself, and is also stapled to 2 denies and 2 psychic casts, which is phenomenal. And then the other component of that unit being a relatively effective Smash character to fight in the late game, who's basically the equivalent of a Smash Captain. He does a little bit more damage on average than a Space Marine Smash Captain, depending on the chapter and the number of Warlord traits and relics you've assigned to that guy. But he was also 270 points, so that was sort of difficult to swallow. Now, if you considered it as the Hive Commander and Psychic component being worth like 150 or so points, then 120 point Smash character with 6 Strength, 8, 3 flat damage attacks, deal mortal wounds is pretty good. That's actually a profile that you would want to take, especially since it's coming stapled to an 18-inch threat range and a relatively resilient body. 12 wounds with a 3+ invulnerable save in melee is pretty good, but now he's only 240 points. So whenever you get into those fights with other similarly costed Smash characters, and Swarmlord eventually loses because he's a little bit below the curve, especially in terms of special characters. If you compare him to characters like Drazhar, he sort of pales in the comparison, but at only 240 points, that's much more palatable. And it means that because he's already basically slotting into every single Tyranid list ever made, every list just got cheaper. It's less of a discount to Swarmlord and more of a discount to every single unit in the faction. So, I mean, Swarmlord's incredible. He's phenomenal. He encapsulates everything that's great about Tyranids: a strong psychic phase, good melee, incredible threat range. He has total domination of the movement step of the game. If you're not playing Swarmlord in your lists, that's a problem. You should make sure you have that guy. He's incredible. Moving down to the Tervigon, this is going to be a really interesting discussion, I think. I don't necessarily really like Tervigons, especially because their interaction with the reinforcement points mechanic is not great. They can spawn Termagants, and if you look at their datasheet and say, oh my god, every turn this thing just puts 10 Termagants on the table, that's like netting 250 points. Unfortunately, it's not, because you do have to prepay the points to bring those Termagants into your list, which you would just put the Termagants in your list to begin with. Now, the upside of Termagants is that they can replenish large units of Termagants, which is good. The downside being that typically when you're taking a large unit of Termagants, they are Devourer armed, and this model can only respawn Termagants with Flesh Borers. So there's a lot of anti-synergy with this unit, not to mention the fact that most armies can one-shot 30 Termagants pretty consistently. And the Tervigon itself mostly is combat ineffective. It does some okay damage. Unfortunately, only a 4+ weapon skill is not great. It does cast spells in the psychic phase. It does have a gun, but it's not particularly good at doing any of those things. It's mostly reliant on its support abilities, but those support abilities aren't phenomenal. I am going to put it sort of at the bottom of B tier here. I think there are lists that can use Tervigons, and I don't want to write them off completely, but I do think that the archetypes that are bringing Termagants are probably relatively suboptimal. Now, that said, if you are bringing those mass Devour Termagants, one thing that Termagants can do is give them reroll 1s to hit in the shooting phase, which is good because if they're already units of 30 models, they're rerolling their 1s to wound already. So they actually become relatively efficient with the Tervigon nearby. The downside is that it's the 200-point model, so you could just be bringing another unit of Termagants for the amount of points you're spending on giving them rerolls. But, given that you probably want to double tap that unit, you want to concentrate buffs on them, it does make sense. The Tervigon can also be relatively difficult to kill. They do have a toughness 8 body with 14 wounds, and if you elect to add Dermic Symbiosis to the unit, they're a tough nut to crack, especially given the fact that your opponent does not want to attack them. Next up is Tyrant Guard. I don't have a ton to say about this unit. I was actually pretty high on them at the start of 9th edition because the emphasis on taking the center of the table and holding it on one of the toughest bodies in the faction is good, especially when you compound that with stuff like enhanced resistance to give them ignore AP 1 and 2. They can be a difficult nut to crack. The downside is that they're not actually that difficult to kill. The downside is that there's only ever 5 or 6 of them in a unit, so you're only ever buffing 18 wounds worth of frontline models with those adaptive physiologies, which is a far cry from, say, buffing 9 warriors with that same upgrade, who then also have objectives secured, have a boatload of attacks, and end up costing way less. Unfortunately, Tyrant Guard are just phenomenally overcosted. They're more expensive per model than a Terminator, and when you compare those two profiles, it's sort of laughable in the comparison. So I was hoping Tyrant Guard had something to do in 9th edition, but unfortunately it just wasn't really to be. Now that said, we will talk about Hive Tyrants a little bit later on in this video, and obviously the Swarmlord is also a Hive Tyrant and is the best model in the faction. So the ability to intercept wounds for your Hive Tyrants and allow those models to play a little bit more aggressively while not being in danger of being killed by enemy anti-tank is actually good. Whether it's, 100 plus points of your army good, probably not, but they do have something they do. That's why I'm not putting them down here in D tier in the bottom, but unfortunately, I don't think there's much to say here. So I have rearranged the list a little bit. Next up, we're going to be talking about all of the Carnifex variants. So let's just get through all of them real quick. Now, I did a huge video on Carnifexes a couple weeks ago, so if you want to hear me talk in depth about each of the different Carnifex variants and the ways that they can be used, pros and cons of each of their individual datasheets, I highly recommend you go check out that video. I'll put a link down in the video description. So I will cut this a little bit short because I do talk about all of those at great length in that video. So, first off, we have the Screamer Killer. Now, unfortunately, with these guys, they're a little bit inflexible, and they are paying points for a really terrible ranged attack with their Bioplasma. So, I think we are going to put Screamer Killers down here in C tier. I don't think, really, I'd ever be looking to take them. Thornbacks do have a little bit of an interesting position because they ignore cover when they're making their attacks against infantry models, which actually is a pretty big deal. Now, the downside is that their profile is always split between ranged and melee, which is never where you want to be with a standard Carnifex. I think I am going to put them sort of bottom B tier here, basically for the ability to ignore cover. I don't think I would ever actually take them, but if you're looking for something unique, they do have that ability. And, if you play in a meta game that uses a lot of cover and has a lot of high armor save infantry, like 3+ armor save infantry that's going to be 2+ armor save in cover, Thornbacks actually can fight them relatively efficiently. And Thornbacks also can take enhanced senses and don't break the bank doing it either. So there are upsides to taking Thornbacks, but I don't like them over top the regular Carnifex, so I will put up in B tier here. I do talk at great length in that video of how to use Carnifexes. Basically, I think the only appropriate way to do it is taking a quad Devourer build, so Devourers with Brain Leech Worms for 24 strength 6 shots out of each Carnifex. Once you've upgraded them with Enhanced Senses and Spore Cysts, they're around 130 to 140 points apiece, if I remember correctly, which is a lot for an 8-wound model. They're not very efficient. They don't have much else going on, and a lot of times they take a lot of focus to make viable. I think the best way to run them is in a Morphic Sinews custom High Fleet detachment so that they can advance and fire those weapons without penalty, and that really mitigates the short range of Devourers pretty significantly. But if you do that and you take a unit of 3 of them, or maybe a couple units, and you have 5 or 6 on the table, they do just rinse everything in the center of the table. So there are upsides to taking standard Carnifexes. I don't hate them, but I don't really like them too much. Now, the Stonecrusher Carnifex is a really interesting case. They have some really good melee profiles, but they don't really deliver them very well. I think I am going to put them maybe around Thornbacks here. They only come in singletons. You can't take them in units of 3, so you can't take as many of them as you can the other Carnifexes, which is fine. But they do potentially do a lot of damage to vehicles or monsters, big, heavily armored stuff, especially with their Crushing Claw. But there's a lot of problems with the datasheet. I do talk about it in the Carnifex video. They can take one of each weapon, but there's never any reason to take but there's no benefit to having both weapons, and there's only a benefit to having 2 claws, which is vastly the most expensive build. You can have the flail, which gives you additional attacks. You can double out your attacks with the flail, which is fine, but not particularly exciting. And just, it feels like a poorly thought out data sheet that needs another iteration, I think, before it's good. There's definitely a universe in which Stonecrusher Carnifexes become good in the future, but I don't think I would take them right now. Now, Old One Eye is a bit of a different case. Unfortunately for him, and this is the case of a lot of the Carnifex variants, is that they're predicated on stacking hit buffs, and Old One Eye especially, because previously his mechanic was that he exploded his attacks on 6+, but it was a modified 6+, and you could stack a whole bunch of +1s to hit. You could take Prey Sight for +1, he could charge with the Living Battering Ram rule for +1, and he gave himself +1. So he always exploded on 5s. When he charged, he exploded on 4s down to 3s. So he made additional attacks on 3+ to hit, which means that Old One Eye was a blender of a unit. The downside is that he's a bit of a glass cannon. As soon as he commits, he doesn't have an invulnerable save. He is only toughness 7, and he cannot be upgraded with adaptive physiologies because he's a named character, which means that he basically died immediately, which was okay because a lot of times you would send him into a knight or something very expensive, and he would fight, double fight, they'd kill him, he'd fight again, and he would just kill whatever he sunk into. The downside now is that ability doesn't work. So his data sheet is sort of fundamentally broken. He does have the upside of being a character Carnifex who, in addition to being bodyguarded by other Carnifexes, which is cool, but honestly not that good, he is untargetable. And that is something important. You know, he still deals a reasonable amount of damage if he commits into a big tank or something, and you have the CP to fuel him up with Voracious Appetite, with double fighting. He will probably kill whatever he touches, even without those compounding exploding attacks. But he's 200 points, and as soon as he charges anything, he's going to die. And if your opponent has any fast smash characters, they're going to focus fire that dude down immediately. If they have fast melee that's relatively efficient, they can just go in and kill Old One Eye before he gets to commit, and it's very sad. So I'm going to put Old One Eye probably low B here, probably somewhere in here. Moving down here to the Maleceptor. This is another really interesting one because the Maleceptor has been right at the cusp of playability for a really long time, and I think it's a little bit below the curve of where you want a unit to be, but there's always, especially in a list that's taking a lot of heavily armored monsters, there's always the little voice in the back of my head that's just like, take a Maleceptor. It'll be good. It's fine. And I do think that the Maleceptor does belong somewhere in the B tier here. You're not going to take a Maleceptor every game, for sure. They're not efficient enough for that, but in the lists that are built around using a Maleceptor, they are very effective. Now, the reason for that is that they give you access to the Encephalic Diffusion stratagem, which reduces incoming enemy attack strength for ranged attacks by 1 when targeting any friendly unit within 6 inches of the Maleceptor. Now, unfortunately, it is 2 CP per round to use it, and it is used proactively, not reactively, which means you use it at the start of your opponent's turn, and they then can make their target selections with knowledge of Encephalic Diffusion in mind, which means a lot of times you only get it turn 1 when you can put all of your important stuff in range of the stratagem and use it to make sure that everything is -1 strike to be attacked. Now, honestly, especially if you're going second into a very heavy Alpha Strike list, that is enough. That's all that you need, because immediately, after you go second, especially if you're compounding that defensive aura with other auras like Spore Clouds, with, High Fleet Leviathan for a 6+ damage ignore, for example, you can make your heavy monsters relatively resilient, and then you're double moving them up into your opponent's face, and you're beaten face with them. So the Maleceptor is a fine unit. The defensive capabilities are good. They're something you can't get anywhere else in the faction. Against a lot of weapon profiles, especially against T4 or T8 models, it is functionally equivalent to -1 to wound for 2 CP on your whole army, which is really good. The Maleceptor itself is a fine kind of midline unit. They have 2 psychic casts. They only know 1 power and smite, but they get +1 to cast their powers all the time, which is great. It's like having a second Resonance Barb in your list, which, if you played with the first Resonance Barb, is really good. They can even deal mortal wounds by sacrificing their psychic casts, which is good if you're playing into an army that has a ton of anti-psychic defense. The ability is very bad. It's one of the most poorly thought out abilities in all of 40k, but it is nice occasionally to have that option. They also punch okay in melee. I mean, they don't have enough attacks and their weapon skill sucks, but they do have a d6 damage monstrous Scything Talon, so they can occasionally put some wounds through on something, but the real kicker of this unit is that it has the defensive profile of a Hive Tyrant while being significantly less expensive and not a model that your opponent is really incentivized to attack, which means that you can actually play them very aggressively And your opponent doesn't want to point their anti-tank at this thing because a 4+ invulnerable save is going to bounce a lot of that. And once it gets through, and then once they finally kill it, you're like, all right, man, get your 2 points on Bring It Down. Good job, dude. And it takes like their entire turn to do so. So it's an interesting unit, and once you play them and use them effectively, they actually feel pretty good, but they are not a unit for every list. They're very expensive. The stratagem to protect your stuff is also very expensive, and it really requires you to build a list around it. Again, toughness 4 and toughness 8 are the breakpoints where most weapons really have a tough time getting through that encephalic diffusion. So you have to be building, multiple Heirodules or super heavies or masked warriors or something like that to really make the most use of that stratagem. Moving on to some troops options, we're going to talk about Termagants here. And we're going to put Termagants in A. Now, A, like I mentioned before, is going to be our staples for the faction. These are units that you're going to take every game. They're not particularly flashy, but they'll win you the game just based on what they do. And Termagants are an effective and cheap objective secured unit. For 50 points, you get 10 models with objective secured. Being Tyranids, they're already fast. Their base only move 6, but you can double move them with Metabolic Overdrive. You can triple move them with Swarmlord. If you're Kraken, you can opportunistic advance them to increase their advance distance. You can also take the Devourer version if you want them to kill some infantry. Personally, I don't like Devourer Termagants, but I do recognize the situations in which they're very useful. It does require kind of a perfect storm of matchups in order to make that weapon profile useful, and unfortunately short range means that they have to get up the table quickly. They're often in charge range after they do it. They can't really damage armored infantry, especially if they're in cover at all. As soon as you get to a 2+ armor save, you don't care about Devourers. And so it requires you to be shooting at light infantry that can't really threaten you super hard and has a lot of units in range. So if you elect to double tap, you have multiple things to target because a lot of times they're just going to be pulling the units out of your range because your range is so short. So there's a lot of downsides to the Devourer Termagant build, but even if you're just bringing 10 units of 10 Termagants, you're probably fine. While we're here, let's go ahead and talk about Hormagaunts too. They basically fall into the same category as Termagants. They're good objective secured units. They are an upgrade over Termagants, and if you have the 10 points to upgrade the Termagant unit to the Hormagaunt unit, I would do that basically every time, but it's not required. Hormagaunts are mostly a quality of life upgrade over Termagants. They give you 2 extra inches of movement and a better melee profile in exchange for their gun and costing 1 more point per model. And especially the extra 2 inches of movement makes them much better at scoring secondary objectives, like especially secondaries that require actions or engage in all fronts. They compound any of your double or triple movement effects. So Hormagaunts are generally pretty good, and oftentimes their 2 attacks apiece in melee is pretty annoying, especially for enemy light infantry. If your opponent has stuff like Harlequin Troopers or Repentia, some of these toughness 3 infantry without amazing saves, Hormagaunts being able to punch them effectively actually kind of messes up your opponent's fight phase selection. I love Hormagaunts. If you don't have the points to take them, Termagants are fine. They're both objective secured infantry that are great at doing what they do. Moving down to the Heirophant, we have, unfortunately, I think, have another entry into D here. Now, the Heirophant itself isn't the worst profile ever. I mean, it's 850 points, which is a lot. And unfortunately, being a single Lord of War has its own anti-synergies built in, especially since it won't get any High Fleet adaptations because for some reason super heavy detachments don't give up High Fleet adaptations. In GT 2021, the points cost to take a super heavy detachment has been decreased, so it doesn't cost you 3 CP anymore. You get some of those refunded. Thank goodness. But the downsides of a super heavy detachment are still there. That is a big downside, although it's not the end of the world. And Hierophants can be supported relatively well. Now, the downsides to the Hierophant are, first off, the comparison to the Harridan. And in the comparison, a Hierophant comes out pretty significantly the loser. They're not really that much more difficult to kill. They don't really deal that much more damage. And a Harridan is also faster. The other issue that Hierophants have is their massive size. They are hull measurers, so they measure from the entirety of their model, not just a base. And the downside is that the model is so physically large that on long table edge deployment zones, they actually don't fit in the deployment zone, meaning that in most formats, you have to take the first turn off of using your incredibly expensive Lord of War choice. So in basically 1/3 of the games that you play, this thing does nothing for the first turn of the game. So if you go to a tournament, there's a 1 in 3 chance that your 850 point model does nothing, comes on the table, gets shot, and, gets bracketed or killed or targeted down. It's just too bad, and I think it's just wildly overshadowed by the Harridan, unfortunately. Now, moving on to the Dimachaeron. This is going to be a little bit of an interesting discussion. So Dimachaerons are just coming off a relatively big nerf in the latest set of erratas that, in my opinion, was not entirely warranted. I don't like Dimachaerons. I understand why they're being played. Obviously, the ability to have pseudo-fly is very good, especially for a melee monster. And they do some of the most efficient damage out of the entire faction. I mean, D3+3 Strength 8 weapons is phenomenal. They're monsters, so they have access to Voracious Appetite to reroll all of their wound rolls. Their Thorax Spine Maw occasionally comes into play and deals additional mortal wounds. They can be difficult to kill, 18 wounds with a built-in invulnerable save, and potentially a 5+ damage ignore. All of these are good things that I'm talking about. The other benefit is that Dimachaerons don't require any adaptive physiologies to be made efficient. Their damage is already good enough to play without Murderous Size. They already have a 5+ invulnerable save to play without Dermic Symbiosis. So really, they're kind of a fire and forget missile that you don't have to put any thought into. The big downside is that a lot of these attributes do come with their own drawbacks. First off, the biggest one we'll talk about first is that 18 wounds characteristic. That does make them pretty tanky. It is difficult to one-shot a Dimachaeron with a lot of stuff. The downside is that you can be seen through obscuring terrain, especially in in-person tables where you don't necessarily have big like WTC-style Ls that can protect large units like Knights or Mortarion or Dimachaerons in this case. A lot of times these venues rely on the obscuring keyword to make otherwise not line-of-sight blocking terrain into line of sight blocking terrain. So a ruin wall with a bunch of windows in it with the obscuring keyword 90% of the time works the same as a big Nova L that's opaque, unless you're talking about an 18 wounder, in which case your opponent can directly shoot right through that thing and you don't even get the opportunity to shoot back at them. So if you lose the roll to go first, especially against a heavy gun line army, your opponent is just going to aim every gun they have at that Dimachaeron and rip it off the table before it gets to activate. This means that in a lot of matchups, the usefulness of a Dimachaeron depends entirely on your roll to go first. And as someone who's looking for consistency in my list building, that's just not a place I want to be with them. I talked about how maneuverable they are as well. They do have the ability to move over walls and intervening models, and especially charge over intervening terrain, basically like a Harlequin trooper can, and this is one of the most unique abilities in the game, and certainly in the faction, because even our flying models can't ignore vertical distance when charging. Only the Dimachaeron can, which is great. The issue is that the Dimachaeron is physically enormous, which compounds the problem of it being 18 wounds and hard to hide, but also they have a huge base, and that means a lot of times, even if you have the raw charge distance to charge over a wall or into a building, they oftentimes are very easily screened out. All your opponent has to do is put their units next to the wall so that there's no space for the Dimachaeron to physically place its base once it charges over, and that means it can't charge you. All of those issues are a reason that I was already not playing Dimachaerons, and I had moved to other anti-tank options, melee options in my armies, and then on top of that, they got hit with the points nerf. So I don't rate Dimachaerons pretty highly. I do understand that there are matchups and there are situations where they are very effective and very good, and obviously they put up some results. We've had 2 GT wins from Tyranids over the last couple of weeks, both of which running double Dimachaerons, and I mean that's why they're seeing some nerfs. Now with their points increase, I don't think they're really worth playing. Now, that said, I think I can't conscionably put them below B tier. I think they're going to be somewhere in here, you know, probably somewhere next to Carnifexes, in my opinion, and I definitely understand that there are a lot of situations where Dimachaerons are going to be more effective than the other options that we'll talk about to take their place later on. For example, if your meta is a bunch of Imperial Knights or a bunch of Death Guard stuff with mass toughness 8, Dimachaerons are great at killing that stuff. And if that's a problem that you're really worried about, I would consider playing Dimachaerons. But if you're looking at more of a mid-range option and you're not necessarily focused on killing that specific profile, I would throw Dimachaerons in the garbage. They're unfortunately not consistent enough for me to really rate them super highly. Moving on to Spore Mines. This is an interesting unit because they're one of the cheaper options for screening out your backline. They also have good synergy with the Spore Field stratagem. Obviously, you can leave points out of your list to begin with so that you can spend 3 CP at the start and give yourself access to some forward deploying Spore Mine units. That's especially good in matchups like Raven Guard, where your opponent's going to want to use pregame moves to really hammer you on turn 1. And outside of Spore Field, Tyranids have absolutely no defense against that. In addition, being 30 points, and while they don't count as models for missions, they do count as models for screening, so you can spend basically nothing to put them in the back line of your table edge, screen out units trying to perform actions, or score line breaker, or engage on all fronts. There are uses for Spore Mines. That said, I do think that there are better options in that slot, so we're going to put them down in C here as well. And the other downside of taking that Spore Field stratagem is that if you don't need it in a matchup, because it costs reinforcement points, you have already allocated those points to reinforcements, and there's not much else you can do with the points that you've saved for Spore Fields. So usually you're playing a unit down already. So I think the opportunity cost of that Spore Field tech is not worth it when you're only looking at affecting a handful of matchups, which is why I don't rate it more highly than I do. If you're worried about stuff like Raven Guard, stuff like pregame movements really screwing you, definitely consider setting those points aside. But if you're going into a larger event, your chances of hitting those matchups is so low, it's not worth taking the loss in percentage points in all of your other matchups in order to make up for that. Next up, talking about Deathleaper. 65-point character lictor, and I think in my last video I rated Deathleaper relatively highly. I was like, 65 points for a character keyworded lictor seems fine. It's going to be untargetable. She's -1 to hit. She's relatively difficult to pin down. Deathleaper seems fine, but what I didn't consider at that point was that character models cannot perform the Deploy Scramblers action, or as it is now, the Retrieve Octarius data action. And that is the reason that you're taking lictors. So the reason that lictors have a spot in your army is totally uninteractable by Deathleaper, and I actually think that that puts her down in the D category here. We'll put her at the top of D. She does have a pretty okay profile, and obviously being untargetable for most of the time is going to be pretty effective, but unfortunately her melee profile isn't good enough to... her melee profile isn't good enough, really, to claw her way back. She gives up assassinate points. She's not that hard to kill. She can't perform a lot of these actions, and that makes her basically unplayable. I don't think I would touch Deathleaper anytime in the near future. Now, moving on to some other interesting monster options, we do have the Barbed Heirodule here today. So this is the ranged cousin of the Scythed Heirodule that we'll talk about, and I'm going to put this thing over here in B. Now, there's an interesting comparison between the Barbed Heirodule and the Exocrine. Both of them are toughness 8 monsters, and both of them have 12 attacks with a 2 damage weapon. The Barbed Heirodule trades 1 point of AP for a point of strength, but doesn't have the same synergy with High Fleet Kraken that the Exocrine does, which makes it so incredibly efficient. And once you put Symbiostorm on an Exocrine, it actually wildly damages a Barbed Heirodule, which also costs 100 extra points. That said, the Barbed Heirodule comes in with 18 wounds and a 2+ armor save alongside that toughness 8, which means a lot of times it's not necessary to upgrade it with Dermic Symbiosis because it's gonna be saving on relatively reasonable numbers anyway. Even an AP3 las cannon is gonna be putting it on a 5+ armor save, so it's basically the same as Dermic Symbiosis in that situation. If you're playing High Fleet Jormungandr, it's always in cover, so it goes down to a 1+ armor save, which means it's saving on 4s against AP3 weapons, which is very difficult to get through. And as soon as you compound any other defensive technology, I mean, we just talked about the Maleceptor. On top of that, this thing is just a ridiculous pain to remove. On top of that, the melee profile is insanely good, which means that not only can it actually fight in the late game, units coming in to engage it to restrict its target selection also might just die if it kills them in melee. So there's a lot of upsides to taking Barbed Heirodules. I think they are a little bit too expensive for what you get for them, but I do see their usefulness in a ton of lists, so we're going to put them in B tier. Next up, talking about the Broodlord. Now, this placement's going to be really tough. I want to put them in B tier, but I do think the Broodlord has a little bit more utility than that. I'm going to put a Broodlord in A tier, but with the caveat that unlike the other units that we're going to be seeing in A tier, I don't think it's quite as much of a staple of the faction as it is just a relatively efficient pick. Broodlords have a decent melee profile. They're not great, but they're okay. They cast a psychic power. They're one of the best recipients for Resonance Barb in the faction, which feels really good when you have it because then they can smite, they can cast their power, they can deny twice, and they're always usually up sort of in the midline of the table. And all of those are really good. In addition, they buff Genestealers, which is one of our best infantry options. And as soon as the Broodlord's sitting there with the Genestealers and they're hitting on 2s and they're rerolling 1s, and they've just become this incredibly efficient infantry blender, it feels incredibly good. The downside is that you're taking up an HQ slot, which is a big deal in Tyranids. They also give up Assassinate, they give up Abhor the Witch, and being a very flimsy frontline character, they are almost always dead by the end of the game. They only have a 4+ save, 5+ invulnerable. Anything that just looks at these things is going to wipe them off the table immediately, which means they're often giving up those Assassinate points. So you can't really like take them in triplicate and use them as trading pieces as much as you would want to, because their damage output isn't quite there, their resilience isn't quite there either, but their support abilities kind of make up for it. So I do like Broodlords. I think I've been converted to the Church of the Broodlord. I don't take them in every list, but I do consider them in a lot of lists, especially if there's already Genestealers in my list, which usually there are. Now moving down, this is going to be a pretty easy pick here. We have the Exocrine. And I can't believe that for the longest time in 8th edition, I didn't really rate the Exocrine. I was like, oh, it's only move 6. It costs CP to shoot its gun, basically, after it moves. It's only strength 7. It's like an autocannon with extra steps. But holy crap, was I wrong. I'm glad that end of 8th, moving into 9th edition, I came around on the Exocrine and I started playing them more often because these are the backbone of a Tyranid shooting base. And I mentioned at the top of the video, most Tyranid armies are going to be built out of a Kronos detachment, and one of the big, huge reasons to take that Kronos detachment is to buff these Exocrines. With Symbiotic Devastation, they can move and shoot with their weapon. Based on the May FAQ, they can now fall back and shoot with their weapon. Because they're High Fleet Kronos and Symbiotic Devastation counts them as remaining stationary, they then reroll their ones to hit automatically. If you are Symbiostorming them, they give themselves +1 to hit, so they explode on 5s instead of just 6s, and with those reroll ones, you have additional chances to roll those 5s to then explode for additional attacks. And their high volume means that stratagems like Pathogenic Slime can affect them much more efficiently than it can a lot of other ranged platforms in the faction. The big downsides are that they're slow, they don't affect the center of the table, and their weapon profile sometimes is not quite there, especially against Toughness 8. Having Strength 7 sucks, and having a 2 damage weapon with a lot of damage reduction in the game right now also kind of sucks. But usually you'll find Exocrines are still able to pull back their points value if you use them over the course of a game, even against armies that are very difficult for them to wound, because if you play them conservatively and they're able to fire over the course of the entire game. Also being Toughness 8 bodies a lot of times and a lot of times able to sit in dense cover means that sometimes your opponent just has a hard time removing them. And if they have Strength 8 weapons and don't spike on their 4+ to wound, sometimes they just don't die. If they have Dermic Symbiosis on them, they're also even more difficult to kill. They're just a phenomenal option. Putting 1 in your list is never bad. Putting 2 in your list is often the way to go. Now, moving on to Genestealers, this is going to be another interesting one because I think the place for them is either high B or low A. I don't consider them a staple of the faction in as much as you should be taking them in all of your lists, and they're going to be performing this incredibly impactful, very crucial role, like a Termagant or a Hormagant would, where they're obsecking your objectives, they're contesting your opponent's objectives, they're performing actions. But they do fill a role in the faction that you can't really find anywhere else, and that is a fast, objective-secured anti-infantry option that's actually effective. With 4 attacks apiece at their top bracket, I guess, for the unit, with the ability to reroll 1s thanks to Scything Talons built in, with a bunch of AP values if you want to swing against higher armored targets. They have a wide variety of units that they're effective against. They're great into horde units. They're great into, marine equivalent units with 3+ invulnerable saves, or 3+ armor saves, excuse me. And they're 20 models with objective secured if you're bringing the full unit. In addition, in the May FAQ, they dropped 2 points a model, so you actually lose 40 points on the cost of an entire unit, which means the trade, it feels a lot better. A lot of times, Genestealers, especially if you're using them as a silver bullet to just kill an important enemy unit that you were really worried about, the trade felt really bad. So for example, 20 Necron Warriors marching up the table is relatively difficult for Tyranids to deal with unless they can 1-2 punch with psychic powers in addition to melee. and then also be able to fight through the reanimation protocols. But once you've dinged the unit up a little bit, a unit of Genestealers, especially with support like a Broodlord, is going to be able to go in and just neutralize that unit. The downside is that you just trade Genestealers for them. They require support, so they're more than the 300 points they used to be, and they're only killing a 260-point unit for a 300-point unit. And it never felt good. There are upsides to that trade. First off, your opponent has to kill them, because if they don't, it's really bad. So a lot of times they eat all of your opponent's anti-infantry for a turn, which is good. They also objective secure at least one of your opponent's objectives away every time, because putting 20 models, highly lethal models, onto an objective, you're going to contest it regardless. And they're also good against light infantry, which is an issue that Tyranids, and especially the more standard Tyranid lists, have a little bit of trouble with. Devourer Termagants can only go so far. Exocrines can fight them a little bit. Hive Guard are terrible at it. A lot of the big melee monsters are also terrible at it. But throwing a unit of Genestealers in your list is effective. You know, they have 80 attacks. They can hit and run with overrun. They can bounce in and out of the fight. And it really shores up that matchup. Doesn't solve it entirely, but it really helps a ton. With the additional upside that having a high AP value makes them effective against highly armored targets as well, which is not something that Devourer Termagants can do. As soon as you play against a bunch of Space Marine Terminators or something, those Devourer Termagants are doing stone cold nothing, whereas Genestealers can go in and kill 5 Terminators, no problem. So there's a ton of upside to Genestealers. They're highly flexible, they're highly lethal, they have objectives secured, they're good at playing for objectives and contesting your opponent's objectives and scoring you primary points. The downside is that they're ridiculously expensive for that flexibility. So I wouldn't put Genestealers super high on the list, but if you're practiced at using them and you're prepared to play the finesse game that Genestealers require, you're going to want to put them in all of your lists, because they give you something that no other unit in the faction can give you, which is that fast objective secured that also is good in basically every matchup. I like Genestealers. I recognize that they're not perfect for every list, but I do think it's worth considering putting them in your army. Okay, moving on down to, we got some Tyranid flyers here, and actually let's rearrange this to put all 3 of the aircraft together. These aren't actually aircraft, but they are flyer battlefield roll, so I don't know, close enough. First off, we have the Harpy. Unfortunately for these 2 units in the kit, I did call the Hive Crone the worst unit in the faction, and we're basically going to be continuing on that trend. So we're going to put both of these ladies down at the very bottom here. They're probably worse than all this other stuff. Unfortunately, they're insanely expensive. They cost 150 plus points per. They're only toughness 6 with a 4 plus armor save, no hard to hit, no defensive technology at all, and they give up 2 points for bring it down. So they are almost automatically dead as soon as they commit into something. Now they are fast. The base 30-inch movement is good, but they're not aircraft, so they don't come with the attributes of the aircraft keyword, the ability to fly off the table, to deep strike back in, all of these cool things that they could potentially do being aircraft. They also have terrible combat stats. Weapon skill 4, ballistic skill 4 degrades to 5 very quickly, which sucks. So they're not even that good at fighting and dealing damage. It's so many downsides for a 150 plus point unit. It's just never take them. Just never, don't ever do it. There are some situations in which they can be useful. If the 30-inch movement is good for you and you need a unit that can run up and engage in all fronts without needing any support, they can just do that. They can run up and engage guns because they can move and charge. Double moving them moves them 60 inches, which is pretty cool with Swarmlord, but you can spend a couple CP to support a much more effective option elsewhere in the codex, and I don't think it's worth trying to make these ladies work. With that, let's move on to the actual single aircraft unit in the faction, the Harridan. When it came out, I was convinced to play a Harridan after IAC got released, and I played a couple games with it, and I liked it. The Harridan does a lot of damage. It's ridiculously difficult to remove from the table. There are some big downsides, though. The first one being, back in the day, it cost 3 CP to include in your army, and it didn't benefit from any Hive Fleet adaptations. That's still the case. It doesn't get any sub-faction abilities if you include it. But, like we talked about with the Hierophant, a lot of times you're going to be refunding a couple CP from that super heavy detachment, which was a big downside of Harridan lists. They were super CP starved. And now you're going to have a couple more to play with, which is good. Harridan also eats one of your adaptive physiologies. You're always going to want a Dermic Symbiosis this thing. But a lot of times that means that if your opponent doesn't have the correct anti-tank to kill it, which is anti-tank that is ranged because you can't necessarily attack it in melee, that also can get through the innate -1 to hit, that is also high enough strength to get through toughness 8, and high enough volume to deal 34 wounds worth of damage. Once you get through that, a 5+ invulnerable save can just axe your opponent's ability to remove this thing. And oftentimes Harridans will just go the entire game. Your opponent will commit into them. Either they have to overcommit to kill it, which takes, 2 turns of their entire army attacking it, for example, or they just never kill it and it gets to do its thing for the entirety of the game. The downside is that they are aircraft keyworded, which means that they are a 700-point model that cannot contest or control objectives, even when it's hovering. So even when it's charging your enemy units on objectives, it will not be able to grab them, meaning that the only way it interacts with objectives is killing enemy models off of their objectives. So when you're playing a Harridan list, you're playing an attrition list, which is a huge downside for Tyranids, because Tyranids are not that good at playing the grind game against a lot of armies. What Harridans do, which is something that the Tyranids almost don't have anywhere else in the faction, is give you a single point-and-click silver bullet to heavily armored, especially toughness 8 models. So when you're thinking about knights, when you're thinking about Mortarion, Harridans just breeze by those things and kill them. Their biocannons come in at strength 10, AP 3 for a flat 3 damage. You're shooting 16 times with a Harridan because you have 2 of them, and you can ping yourself for D3 mortars, which, if you have cast Catalyst on the Harridan, which is probably your Catalyst target every turn, it can potentially ignore with the Catalyst roll. You get +1 to wound, meaning you're wounding everything in the game that doesn't have a transhuman style effect on 2s. So shooting at a knight, winning on 2s, shooting at Mortarion, winning on 2s, any of that stuff, you're going to convert most of your hits. The downside is you have no access to rerolls, so the Harridans can spike low very quickly. If you just roll a bunch of 1s and 2s to hit, you're out of luck. Sorry. Kronos can't help you because you're super heavy. There is some synergy in Jormungandr, which can give them rerolls to hit, which is kind of funny, but I think more cute than good. Can Symbio Storm them in Kronos Detachment because they do have the Kronos keyword, so they will explode 6s, which helps them a little bit. It's effectively +1 to hit if there's no -1s involved, but if you pathogenic slime that weapon, any of those hits that go through are then going to be wounding on 2s for 4 damage, and, I mean, that's enough. 6 converted attacks out of your 16 to hit will kill a knight outright. Almost anything in the game will either be more than half dead or just straight up killed by that single attack. Not to mention the fact that they have a 6 flat damage melee attack, so they can even follow that up with some powerful melee, especially if your opponent doesn't have invulnerable saves in melee. They're hitting on 3s, rerolling 1s, winning on 3s probably with rerolls from Voracious Appetite. And the cutest synergy that I love is that once they kill that thing in melee, they can then overrun and reserve themselves off the table to come back in next turn. So Harridans, there is a big upside to Harridans, which is especially that they shore up those matchups with those heavily armored enemy models. If you're not worried about that, though, there is the downside of your army being terrible at fighting over primary objectives. Just unabashedly awful. So you win some, you lose some. I don't think the Harridan is right for every list, and I think it is a lot of times more cute than good. But that cuteness it's very cute. It's cute to the point where a lot of times tiered bad matchups just fall over and die to this thing. It might switch your matchups so that your previously good matchups are a little bit tougher, but I do think Harridan ends up at top of B here. I think it is a competitive option for a Tyranid army. It's not good all the time. It inherently makes you a skew list, which sometimes you will just automatically lose. There's 15 Las Cannon Iron Striders on the other side of the table, and they just blow this thing off the table turn 1, and you're very sad. But it's certainly something to consider, especially if you're worried about killing stuff like knights. Moving on to the Haruspecs. I did do a Haruspecs video a while ago, so if you want to hear me talk a lot about the Haruspecs and how to use it effectively, I do talk about it there. That said, I don't think the Haruspecs is particularly efficient. It costs the same as an Exocrine and does similar damage, but in melee instead of range, and usually eats a lot of your CP. To combo it off effectively, you need 2 CP a turn, which is just too much. So I think we're going to put the Haruspecs probably down in C tier here. If you want to play them, I don't think they're the worst option imaginable. They're toughness 8. They're relatively difficult to kill. If you get them into the right targets, they can deal a ridiculous amount of damage, triggering additional bite attacks off of their claw attacks and just chaining those together. But I think they require more work than you get out of them for the unit. Moving on to another unit that I don't think needs much introduction. This is the Hive Guard. These guys are going to be up in S tier here. A lot of people complain about Tyranids, and usually when you hear them complain about the faction, it's specifically about Hive Guard. It's not about any of this other stuff that the faction does. It's just about Hive Guard and how oppressive that unit is. I think there is some merit to that. I mean, having indirect fire just in general, especially powerful indirect fire that does a lot of damage, it's gross. It's, frankly, super powerful. It can make a lot of matchups incredibly one-sided if they don't have a way to deal with it, or they have profiles that are killed by Hive Guard very efficiently. The big downside is that there are some drawbacks to Hive Guard. First off, their range is not very good, which is, I think, a good drawback for indirect fire. It means that your opponent can effectively defend against it. There's an easy way to do it. If you don't have perfect terrain, which is basically a big line of sight blocker that's hard to get around directly in the center of your deployment zone so that you have good coverage on all the objectives. If you don't have that to place the Hive Guard behind, they oftentimes can just be outranged. And especially if your opponent has other indirect fire, I'm thinking about things like Manticores, those that will immediately rip a Hive Guard unit off the table without much contest. So there is a downside in that. They also are an expensive unit, 270 points to bring the full unit of 6 with Impaler Cannons, and their relatively large footprint, because their bases are so big, they're on 50mm bases, and they also, because they're incredibly squishy, 4+ armor save, toughness 5, only 3 wounds apiece, as soon as your opponent sees one, half that unit is immediately vaporized. So the safest part of your deployment zone is where Hive Guard are going to be sitting. They're basically going to be taking a lot of real estate behind line of sight blockers from the rest of your army. So if you bringing things like Exocrines or Genestealers or these other monsters that want to be standing behind buildings and hiding behind obscuring terrain, a lot of times they may have to actually deploy out in the open because the Hive Guard are going to be taking that position. That said, if you have a Hive Guard unit in that good matchup, in that good position, where they can't be interacted with by your opponent and they have good angles of fire onto most of the table, there's not much your opponent can do about it. They're just going to get shredded by Hive Guard, and a lot of factions have no way to deal with them and just immediately lose. I think the big upside of Hive Guard isn't necessarily their ability to fire when hidden. It is the ability to shoot at enemy units that you can't see, which shores up some of the problems of Exocrines, where they're slow and they can only fire directly, and they often only have very limited angles of fire, whereas Hive Guard force your opponent to come in and engage your army, which allows a Tyranid army to engage on their terms. That's incredibly important for Tyranids, and Hive Guard are certainly one of the defining units of the faction. I don't love that they dictate the operations of Tyranid armies that much. Powerful indirect fire is not good for the game. Anytime I don't have to take them, I'm pretty happy about that. I would like to see them maybe see a little bit of a nerf in the future so that they are less oppressive in those matchups where they're good. And maybe just give Tyranids some other options to interact with your opponent at long range without it having to be this unit that's kind of relatively oppressive to play against. But clearly it's Games Workshop's vision that Hive Guard should be kind of dictating the pace of engagement in games with Tyranids, because they did decrease their points cost in the January FAQ. So I think it is part of the ethos right now that they're going to be kind of propping up the remainder of the faction until Tyranids see an update. I'm excited for that update, but until then, we are playing Hive Guard. They are good. They're one of the best units in the entire game. They're probably the best indirect fire in the entire game right now. And play them. If you need a gun, Hive Guard are one of the best. All right, moving on to the Hive Tyrant. This is another unit that I'm going to have a lot to say about. It's kind of like Genestealers. I'm not sure whether it goes in A, B. It could also be bottom S, to be perfectly honest. Let's go with the hot take here, because this is what we're in for, and let's put Hive Tyrants at bottom S. Now, at the start of 9th edition, there were some wild drawbacks to taking Hive Tyrants. Your opponents could potentially score 9 points for removing a single Hive Tyrant from the table. They could stack Abhor the Witch with Assassinate with Thin Their Ranks, which scored 1 point off of any 10+ wound models that were killed, and you would score 5 for Abhor, 3 for Assassinate, 1 for Thin, and you would get 9 points for killing that Hive Tyrant. So any lists that focused on Hive Tyrants primarily had this huge downside going in, where losing a single Hive Tyrant could literally lose you the game. In addition, they were also hyper expensive. There was about 245 points to bring a kitted out melee Hive Tyrant, which was ridiculously expensive. That said, between the January FAQ and GT 2021 coming out, Hive Tyrants have gone from giving up a potential 9 points down to only 6 if your opponent takes both Abhor and Assassinate. And their points cost has dropped significantly, 215 points to take a kitted melee Hive Tyrant. These things are very efficient. Now, when we talked about Dimachaerons, I talked about how I didn't necessarily like them. And one of the reasons is that I think, in my opinion at least, they lose the comparison with the Hive Tyrant pretty convincingly. Now, obviously, Dimachaerons do way more damage in melee. D3 plus 3 damage versus flat 3 or flat 4 if you're talking about a smashy Hive Tyrant. Strength 8 versus Strength 7 is a huge cutoff, and they have more attacks. They also have the ability to deal their additional damage with their Spine Maw. No one's going to argue that a Dimachaeron way outdamages a Hive Tyrant. The downside is that Dimachaerons often don't get to do any damage because either you went second and they're dead, or your opponent's able to screen out their ridiculously huge base. And their movement isn't necessarily enough to get them over top of what's in front of them. Hive Tyrants don't have any of these issues. Hive Tyrants are 12 wounds, so they can be screened by obscuring terrain. In addition, they have a base 4 extra inches of movement, 16 inches of movement for a winged Hive Tyrant over top the 12 that a Dimachaeron has, and alongside a double move that compounds that extra movement. So you're moving potentially 32 inches without advancing, without onslaught, without the charge roll, without even taking into account an adrenal glands. And because their base is relatively small, they have a 60 millimeter base. You can fly directly over screens, directly through walls, and charge basically whatever you want. Obviously, they can't charge through walls because they aren't a Dimachaeron, but a lot of times they're so fast, they can just jump directly over whatever is in front of them. A Hive Tyrant with the Swarmlord, with Onslaught on it, threatens almost the entirety of the table. They have the ability to move astronomical distances with adrenal glands on them, especially in High Fleet Kraken, so ensuring you have high advance rolls. You can be moving this model 29 inches with an opportunistic advance, plus 23 with a double move in advance, plus a charge at +1. You can kill whatever you're attacking, overrun for an additional 23 inches. This model is ludicrously maneuverable. It's actually insane. On top of that, they come stock with 2 psychic casts, meaning that while they don't get a Spine Maw ability, they're dealing on average a similar amount of damage to the Spine Maw. They just do it in the psychic phase before they go in, versus having to do it in the fight phase and having your opponent being able to pull models out of melee with you to deny your Spine Maw activation. So the damage is actually relatively similar once you take that all into account. The downside is that when you're taking a Smashy Hive Tyrant, which is my favorite build, it's basically just 2 sets of Scything Talons with Murderous Size on them. So hitting on 2s, rerolling 1s to hit, Strength 7, AP 4 for flat 4 damage. The Strength 7 is a huge downside, and it is one of the reasons that Tyranids often struggle with Toughness 8 units, because outside of the Dimachaeron and some of the Heirodule variants, your melee basically caps at Strength 7 or Strength 8. So you're winning on 4s or 5s, and it can be rough. That said, you do have access to double fighting. You have access to full rerolls from Voracious Appetite. So as long as you don't spike low on your wound rolls, you can usually get there, and you can usually do enough damage to kill whatever you're going into. There are also other builds of Hive Tyrants that I think are relatively efficient. You can take a support build with a Resonance Barb to cast additional powers, Rending Claws, Devourers that can basically function in every phase. They move fast, they shoot, they cast psychic spells, they charge, they reroll all their wound rolls for free. Only D3 damage, which isn't amazing, but when you're doing it on a free weapon on a relatively efficient platform, I think that's fine. You can also just take Quad Devourers and have a 16-inch moving model that has that Carnifex offensive profile, 24 shots and Strength 6 to clear some infantry. So there's a lot of options to take for Hive Tyrants. I think the Smashy Hive Tyrant is my favorite. There are some significant downsides to it. Obviously, being a character and a Psyker, they give up Assassinate and Abhor the Witch, like I said at the top. They also, if you're taking the Smashy builds, eat one of your adaptive physiologies, given that you have to Murderous them. You absolutely have to. But in combination with some relics, you can Resonance Barb any Hive Tyrant you want, which is great. I think they're the best place to put Resonance Barb because they can then smite and cast both their powers, and they're usually in a position to use the additional deny, kind of like a Broodlord is. They also work with some of the more offensive melee relics. Size of Tyrant, if you're bringing a behemoth army, is very solid, gets them to that Strength 8, which is a really big deal, and can still be murderously sized. Xenogenic Acid is also an incredibly powerful one that deals additional mortal wounds to the target on wound rolls of 5+, which actually makes them relatively efficient at killing infantry as well, given that including their tail attack, they have 6 attacks that should convert almost 100%, hitting on 2s, winning on 2s or 3s, and then deal 2 to 3 additional mortal wounds on top of that, meaning that potentially they can kill 8 to 10 models a turn just with their melee profile, which is phenomenal. So there's a ton of synergy, there's a ton of wide open builds for Hive Tyrants and their recent buffs in GT 2021. I've basically replaced any Dimachaeron that I would be including in my list with a Hive Tyrant, and I have not looked back. They do require a lot of skill, and they're not good for every list, which is why I could consider them in any of these slots, but I think we're going to go with the hot take. We're going to put them at the bottom of S tier. Now, moving on to the Lictor, this one should be relatively self-explanatory. We're going to put them somewhere in the top of A tier, I think. We talked about Deathleaper just not working as it's intended role, basically. And lictors are basically the reason that that's the case. They're a single infantry model. They can deep strike innately, doesn't cost you any CP. They are still combat effective, 3 attacks hitting on 2s, wounding most infantry on 2s with potentially 2 damage or rending, depending on the profile you use. Is fine at fighting light enemy infantry units, but realistically, they're going to come in, they're going to score you 2 points for engage, and they're going to score you 3 to 4 points for retrieve Octaria's data, and that's it. You spend 37 points to get like 5 extra points on secondary objectives. Lictors are phenomenal. Every army, in my opinion, should have 2 lictors in it. I could see an argument for 1. I could also see an argument for 3, but never leave home without them. They are so phenomenally good. Not a flashy unit, not a unit that's going to do a lot of damage, but they are going to score you a ton of points. Moving on, we'll talk about the remainder of the Spore Mines. We have Meotic Spores and Mucolid Spores right here. And unfortunately, while I did put Spore Mines kind of high, Spore Mines have some good options. The other versions of Spore Mines certainly don't. Meotic Spores, unfortunately, are kind of ludicrously expensive. They're 20 points per model, and they come only in units of 3+, meaning you're spending 60 points for this unit that doesn't really move very quickly. They're not combat effective. They don't really do that much. So we're actually going to put them somewhere in the bottom tier here. If you want to bring them to do the same thing that the other Spore Mines do, where they just kind of screen out a corner, that's fine. But you might as well be bringing Termagants or Rippers or almost anything else, just regular Spore Mines. Now, the Mucolid Spore is a little bit different because it can be taken in singletons, which in and of itself is a powerful ability. Being able to take single models at any point in 40k is always good. The downside is that they're not a good single model. They only move 3 inches. They're 3 wounds, T3. Like, they'll just immediately die if your opponent looks at them. I'm not jazzed about them, but they're probably somewhere in C tier here. I could see them if you have 20 points left over in your list. You want to bring one of these things to just sit in the back corner of your deployment zone and perform some screening. They can do that, and occasionally we'll ping something for mortal wounds that comes and visits. But otherwise, I don't think I would really be taking them. Moving on, we have another incredibly powerful option for the Tyranid Codex. This is the Neurothrope. Now, Neurothropes have been broken a little bit by 9th edition. They have an ability to reroll 1s during the Psychic phase, and I've talked about this a couple times in the past, but it's actually, per the core rules, it actually doesn't do anything. Because the ability allows you to reroll rolls of 1, not results of 1, it doesn't really work as intended. Per the core rulebook, a result is the facing on a single die in a roll, but the roll is the sum of all of your results. So this model rerolling psychic tests on rolls of 1 means that the sum of both of the dice has to be a 1, which is literally only possible in the Tyranid mirror when you're playing against Kronos and they get Deepest Shadowed and roll a 1. In that situation, they can reroll their psychic test. In every other situation, they actually cannot. The interesting thing is that I don't think that really reduces their effectiveness at all. In the past, before I knew that this rule interaction had been changed in the 9th edition rulebook, I was actually bringing 3 of them in almost every list. But since they don't reroll their 1s to cast currently, I moved down to taking 1 or 2, which just means that with that ability to reroll 1s, they are ludicrously overpowered. Having a 5-wound Psyker that regenerates its own wounds over the course of the game, because they can regenerate when they kill stuff, with a 3+ invulnerable save that is almost impossible to take down. You know, your opponent sends melee units or smash characters or almost anything into them, and they don't die outside mortal wounds unless you spike low on the rolls. And even if they do die, you've only lost a 95-point character. It's not the end of the world. They were hyper-reliable psychic casts. Now they're just regular psychic casts, and you're still going to play them in almost all your lists. I think we're going to put them in A tier here just because of that small nerf, but I think that they are still one of the most effective Psykers in the game. They're certainly one of the most efficient Psykers in the game, with the ability to smite plus caster support power every turn, being entirely invincible and costing less than 100 points. Like, if you compare them to a Space Marine Librarian, this Librarian just goes home and cries. That guy is so sad. Love me some Neurothropes. Definitely still take them, regardless of that rules interaction. And if it ever gets fixed, just take 3 of them for the most part. Smite to your heart's content. Moving down to Tyranid Primes. Oh boy. I hate this guy. He's just the worst. I've always kind of been excited to have Tyranid infantry characters because almost all of the characters in the Tyranid Codex, outside of the Broodlord and the Neurothrope that we've talked about previously, are big, these big stompy monster boys that can get shot at and could die before they get to commit into melee. And so I was always excited to make Warrior Primes like an interesting like little mini Smash character, but none of their weapon profiles are good. They're insanely expensive for not really doing any damage. They can take a gun, which is nice, but it's usually just a death spitter, and they're only ballistic skill 3, so that's not even that exciting. These things are terrible. Their melee weapons are bad, their ranged weapons are bad, and the archetypes they're supporting are inefficient. I would almost never take a Tyranid Prime. I'll put him down somewhere in C tier here. I think probably somewhere over here. That said, the only reason I don't put him down in D tier is he buffs warriors with +1 to hit, which is a really good buff to provide warriors. And there is a single archetype of warrior unit where you do, I think, need this guy. And the big downside is that he is a tax on making ranged warriors. It is the ranged warrior build where he improves their ballistic skill from effectively from 4+ down to 3+ with that +1 to hit. He also gives them access to the same synergy that Exocrines have with Hive Fleet Chronos, in that they then explode on Symbiostorm on 5s rather than 6s. So if you're building a list that is revolving around Tyranid warriors making use of that interaction, that's the single list I would play warrior primes in. Just keep in mind that you're tacking on 80+ points onto the cost of your warrior unit to take this idiot who's going to give up an assassinate point at some point during the game. Moving on to the Pyrovore. This one's a little bit of a fan favorite. A lot of people, they talk about Pyrovores like they're one of the worst units ever played. And when I did my worst units in every faction video, a lot of people were surprised I didn't pick Pyrovores for Tyranids, which kind of shocked me. To start out, Pyrovores are not a great option. They don't really have an effective profile for anything. They do have one kind of terrible heavy flamer. But like we talked about with Mucolid Spores, the ability to take singleton units is super powerful in 40k. Your opponent has to split shots off to dedicate to killing them. They can very efficiently screen out areas of the table, hyper efficiently perform actions, especially since they're inexplicably infantry models, which means they can deploy scramblers, they can or retrieve Octaria's data, they can raise banners, they can do mission-specific actions. And they're only 28 points for a 4-wound model with a heavy flamer, basically. So while I'm not going to sit here and tell you that Pyrovores are great in the new meta game, if you need a utility option that fills in those back corners of your deployment zone, that performs those actions, Pyrovores are really good. I think I'm going to put Pyrovores probably somewhere in B tier here. I don't usually take them, but it is a unit archetype that has traditionally been powerful in 40k, and I have seen them do well and secure wins in competitive events. So play Pyrovores. They screen well, they sometimes shoot infantry, they perform actions well, it's fine. Next up, we're talking about the Raveners, both the Red Terror and her attendant Raveners. This is a unit, I think, very similar to Gargoyles, and we'll probably put them in a similar spot down here, kind of bottom C tier. They're so close. They're so close to being playable. And in the comparison with other units, they just fall apart. And they're kind of emblematic of some faction bloat where they overlap with a lot of other styles of units while being significantly worse than them. So first off, Raveners have a million attacks. If you're playing 2 sets of Scything Talons, which you should be, they're attacking 5 times a piece, hitting on 3s, rerolling 1s, down to hitting on 2s if you have Red Terror nearby. That's a lot of attacks, 45 attacks out of the full unit, and they come in at a base movement of 12. So they're some of the fastest models in the faction as well. They're relatively cheap per model for a 3-wound model as well, but the downside is that they're incredibly easy to kill. They only come in those units of 9, meaning that in the comparison with a unit like Genestealers, they make less attacks, meaning that any buffs you put on them are going to be less effective than they would be on Genestealers. They're so squishy, it's not even funny. Not to mention the fact that they're not objective secured, being fast attack, not troops. Genestealers are the direct comparison point. The Raveners are move 12, but because Genestealers can advance and charge, without any buffs, they come out to about the same threat range. Genestealers on average threaten 11.5 plus the charge, whereas Raveners are coming in at 12 plus the charge. Once you add Hive Fleet Kraken on that to shore up your average advance roll, Genestealers actually threaten around the same that Raveners do. On top of that, Genestealers have almost as many attacks as a Ravener does per model. Their +1 to hit unit is a Broodlord, which comes with psychic tests and a pretty reasonable melee profile himself, whereas the Red Terror doesn't really have those and only comes in with a couple Scything Talons. So I think the big reason to kind of discount Raveners is just that Genestealers do their job, but significantly better. That said, Raveners are a little bit more hyper-focused on killing infantry, and they do that more efficiently than Genestealers do. So if that's something you need, if you need a model with a whole bunch of strength 4 attacks, I would consider Raveners. This is another unit where just a little bit of an improvement to focus their role more heavily on killing infantry could make them see play. Maybe giving them more attacks or interesting abilities, or maybe just an innate AP value on their Scything talents. I don't know. Something to help out Raveners. Their base stats are good, but they're not quite good enough, and a couple buffs, they could be a very playable unit, but right now they're just not quite there. Now moving on to Ripper Swarms. I love these little guys. We're going to put them up in A tier. Basically, all of the Tyranid troops options are good, and Ripper Swarms are a perfect example of that. Not a unit that you would consider being A, troops, what's up with that, but B, highly effective at all. Ripper Swarms are just good. They innately deep strike, they're objective secured, they're cheap as chips. 36 points per unit is phenomenal. They can score engage in all fronts, they can hold objectives down, they have a big base, they're good at screening. I wouldn't take Rippers as your only troop options. Usually you'll want to have the larger units because their footprint is bigger, so that makes them easier to Hive Commander or to cover multiple objectives with, or to screen out large areas of the table. But oftentimes I'll take 3 to 4 units of 10 Termagants or Hormagaunts, and then I'll take between 1 and 3 units of Rippers to fill in some of those additional roles. You almost always reserve all the Rippers. They can drop into your backline objectives in the late game if your objective secured infantry need to push up the table, or they just push up into your opponent's deployment zone. They score you engaged in all fronts, they score you your secondary objectives, and they're super duper useful. There's always at least 1 unit of Rippers in my army, oftentimes a lot more, and especially with the points breaks the Tyranids just got. A lot of Tyranid lists, especially ones with Swarmlord and Genestealers in them, dropped 70 points, which means you drop 1 upgrade somewhere and you get 2 Ripper Swarms into your list, which is just, it's such a quality of life change. Next up, we have the Scythed Heirodule. The big, or I guess they're bigger than a Barbed Heirodule. I'm not sure. I don't know. They do have the tail that sticks up farther, so we'll call it the big brother to the Barbed Heirodule. I think Scythed Heirodules probably live somewhere in the top of B tier here. In my opinion, after the Dimachaeron points increase, Scythed Heirodules have kind of taken their spot in that 230 point pseudo Lord of War space. They have the same or close to the same damage output. They don't innately reroll all of their hit rolls with their talons, which is too bad, but they do reroll ones innately, and they come in at a higher strength. They're strength 10 versus strength 8, which means that they wound most of the game on 3s. And that's just good. So their damage output is equivalent to a Dimachaeron. They're obviously not as maneuverable. Their base is freaking huge, so they're easily screened and they can't move through breachable terrain and buildings and stuff like that. They have to go around. But they also have a gun, which is good. It is a heavy weapon, so they can't advance and shoot it, which is a downside, but it is an 18-inch range off of a 12-inch movement, meaning they threaten 30 inches up the table with 3d6 strength 6 flamer attacks at AP2. If you throw pathogenic slime on these things, it can be a real threat to medium infantry like Space Marines, or even vehicles. They can start chunking wounds off vehicles before they charge in, or you can just forego that and double move them with Swarmlord for a 24-inch threat range. They still have the downside of the Dimachaeron, where being 18 wounds, they are unobscurable, but at toughness 8, especially with Dermic Symbiosis on the unit, they have a much better profile to survive that turn 1 shooting, whereas a Dimachaeron oftentimes will just get ripped off the table by melta-weapons. I love Scythed Heirodules. I think they're great, and I do think that in a lot of lists, they're just going to be supplanting Dimachaerons, the role that Dimachaerons used to fill. Moving down now to the Skyslasher Swarm. Now, I have to give Tyranid Ben, number 1 Tyranid player currently, a little bit of props here for introducing me to the Skyslasher Swarm technology. These things are great. They're not great in the same way that other objective secured options in the Tyranid Codex are, but they are great in that I take them in every one of my lists. And the only reason for that is that they're very fast, and they can score engage in all fronts on turn 1. And that's it. That's what they do. For 45 points, you get 12 inches of movement, so they can advance for potentially 18 inches, and then Metabolic Overdrive to advance again, to sit themselves nicely in a table quarter to score that engage in all fronts. Oftentimes, especially if you're going first into an army with a lot of armor or slow models, having that ability to move incredibly fast with such an efficient unit means that they can jump up and body block models from moving, physically screen out models from coming in through buildings or through narrow passageways, And they're just a very obnoxious unit, especially if your opponent has raised the banners high. They're you can throw onto a banner objective. You don't have to worry about it. They can't put a banner down there. And they immediately score you 2 points and cost your opponent probably 2 points over the course of the game. Very much like a Lictor, you're spending 45 army building points to get between 2 and 5 victory points back over the course of the game, and that is typically very worth it. I love Skyslasher Swarms. They make a place in almost all of my lists. Not in my in-person list yet. My Skyslasher Swarms aren't built, I'm sad to say, but as soon as they're done, I'm going to be playing them in every single game. Next up, we have the Sporocyst. Unfortunately, this big guy is a fortification, so we are going to put him down in the bottom somewhere in here. Now, we talked about the Tyranids' weakness to pre-game movements because they have very little that deploys up the table, and the one redeeming that a Sporocyst has is that it can be deployed outside of 9 inches of enemy model, so it can go outside of your deployment zone up in the front, meaning that it can body block a lot of that pre-game movement, which is good. The downside is that A, it can be screened by enemy forward deployers. They also get hit with the fortification restriction where they cannot be placed within 3 inches of any other terrain feature, which means in a lot of especially denser terrain setups, you actually physically cannot place them because they're a very wide unit. That means you need like basically a 12 or 14 inch area of the table where there's no terrain to be able to legally place this thing down. And oftentimes either that's impossible or it puts it in a position where it's never going to affect the game. That's why fortifications are terrible. And so I think we can actually safely put him probably at the bottom. Moving on to the Exocrine. This is another unit that is so close. It's so close to being good. For that reason, I think we're going to put it probably bottom of B tier here. The Exocrine comes in with a bunch of attacks at strength 7 for D3 damage, full rerolling its wound rolls without even the need for Voracious Appetite. Its damage output is good. It also gives you access to the stratagem to prevent enemies from falling back from it. But the downside is that it's 150 points, toughness 7 with no defensive technology available. I think either if the Exocrine was cheaper or it had a Spore Cyst effect built into it, which it seems like it should, given that it looks like a big Venomthrope, I could see it seeing some play. The fact that it doesn't do any of those things really kills it for me, but this is a unit that just very similar to, some of these other units like Gargoyles and like our Raveners. It is so close to playability, and with a couple changes, you could make it good, but unfortunately, it's just not quite there. Poor little Exocrine. Next up, we'll talk about the last of the Tyranid troops options. This is the Warrior Brood. We're going to put them kind of bottom A tier here. I was very high on Warriors when 9th edition came out. They got a huge points break in the January FAQ. They dropped down to 17 points per model if you were running all Scything Talons, which is the most efficient, I think the best way to run Warriors. But after having played with them for a while and the meta shifting slightly, I've kind of lost a lot of my fire for these guys. A big downside to the unit is that they eat your adaptive physiologies, because if you're taking the units of 9, you almost require enhanced resistance on them so that they can eat anti-infantry shooting and they don't get shredded by it. That makes them very resilient, and I liked the ability to sit in the center of the table in a lot of matchups, just tank your opponent's entire shooting phase, especially if they were running a lot of like autocannon profiles. Those things just bounce directly off Tyranid warriors. Heavy bolters do nothing. A lot of Space Marine armies that weren't running heavy Melta just could not kill them. But as things have progressed, Melta weapons, plasma weapons, all of that has become a lot more powerful and choose through these Tyranid warriors with or without the adaptive physiology. On top of that, I've started running a lot more of monsters in my list. I talked about how much I love Hive Tyrants. I've talked about how much I love Exocrines, and all of these often take my adaptive physiology slots away from warriors. So if you have somewhere else to put that adaptive physiology, most of those places are going to be more efficient than warriors. If you have the extra adaptive physiology slots available, those big 9-man units of warriors are phenomenal. They also help shore up that anti-infantry matchup a little bit. I mean, coming 36 attacks, rerolling ones to hit out of one of those units, especially because they're so efficient, is really nice to have. The flip side is that you can also just run warriors in trios. Just a unit of 3 warriors comes in at 51 points, almost the same cost as 10 Termagants, and they are much more difficult to kill than Termagants. They're +2 to their armor save, +1 toughness, and they can fight enemy light infantry with 12 attacks, rerolling ones to hit. It's not a phenomenal offensive profile, but it is good. They can kill a couple Harlequin troopers, they can kill some Drukhari infantry that come in to fight over your backline just fine. So So I think that's the most common place you're going to see warriors. You can take the big 9-man squads. I think that's okay. I don't think it's super good right now, but I don't hate it at all. And I think there's a lot of matchups that just cannot deal with those big warrior units and fall apart really quickly. So yeah, I mean, I think warriors are great. They are definitely the lowest on the totem pole of Tyranid troops options, but Tyranids have some of the most efficient troops in the entire game. So being the worst of the best is still fine. That puts them above most of the other troops in 40k. So warriors are still great, and I still like them. That's why we're going to put them bottom of A tier here. Moving on to the Biovore, I'm going to go ahead and put the Biovore. I think it belongs somewhere in mid B tier. Certainly above Tervigons, but I think below a lot of these more played options. Biovores have always been a hit or miss unit, usually a miss unit because you want to miss with them so you can generate free Spore Mines. The downside is that those Spore Mines are not often super useful. They give your opponent a charge target if they're not being body blocked by the placement of the Spore Mine, which oftentimes allows them to trade some mortal wounds in the early game for additional board presence, which is just bad for you. There are specific situations and specific matchups where Biovores crush. They just destroy your opponent. If your opponent's running a bunch of melee non-infantry models, Biovores are disgusting. Especially if you can anchor a Spore Mine next to a piece of terrain they can't move through. You can body block huge sections of the table and stop your opponent from moving up at all with a trio of Biovores. You can also potentially be using those Spore Mines that they generate to screen out the entire table from Deep Strikers. And in those situations, Biovores are phenomenally powerful and will sometimes single-handedly win you the game. If you're not in one of those matchups, Biovores are oftentimes a liability and will make your army worse, which is not great for a 50-point model. So that's why we're going to put Biovores right in the middle. I think depending on your metagame, they could be just the best unit in the Codex, but they could also just be terrible and not worth playing at all. I don't usually play them because I don't typically play against the stuff that cares about Biovores, but I do recognize that in some lists, and against some lists especially, they are great. Now moving on to the Tyrannocytes. This thing is, I don't know. It's not super great. It's got some stuff going on. We're going to put it kind of bottom C tier here. If you want to play a Tyrannocyte, you can. They're expensive, and they don't really work well as a transport, but they have a bunch of guns on them, so that's cool. In 8th edition, I played a Jormungandr list that was entirely dependent on buffing Tyrannocytes with Lurking Maws so that they could full reroll all of their Venom Cannons coming out of Deep Strike, and it was actually like really good. 1 or 2 Tyrannocytes coming out of Deep Strike, costing 140 points apiece, kitted with all Venom Cannons and full rerolling their hit rolls, blows up a tank every turn. And after they stand there, they're relatively difficult to kill. I mean, they're not hard. They're toughness 6 with a 4+ save, but since they've already done their damage, you're not that worried about them being attacked, and it's a lot of wounds to chew through for relatively efficient points cost. Also, being able to bring units in out of Deep Strike is fine, especially if you want to be dumping out like 20 Devour Termagants or something, although you could just be spending CPs to bring them in with Pheromone Trail from a Lictor, so they're not really required for that. We'll put them bottom C tier here, I think probably maybe below the Tyranid Prime, just because there's only 1 or 2 situations in which you would want a Tyrannocyte. They are effective when they're good, but moving on, we have the Tyrannifex before we move on to the remainder of the Thropes in the faction, and I think I'm going to put this big fella probably bottom B tier. I think I would consider heavily taking a Tyrannifex if Symbiotic Devastation could target them in addition to Exocrines instead of just Exocrines, because they're a very poorly thought out data sheet. They're a unit with a lot of high impact short range shooting with bad ballistic skill whose abilities all trigger off it standing still. So whoever thought it was a good idea to give this thing like a flesh borer hive with a bunch of shots to compensate for its terrible ballistic skill that was balanced around being able to fire twice but only has an 18-inch range on a unit that only moves 6 inches, it's like, I think the Acid Spray Tyrannifex is the most effective out of all of them, just given the fact that it can ignore its 4+ ballistic skill by automatically hitting with the spray. And when you get to double tap that thing, potentially with Pathogenic Slime online, shooting a bunch of Strength 7 AP 1d3 damage +1 shots is pretty good, but the setup required is immense. You basically have to run 3 of them to deliver 1, and it usually makes its points back, sometimes a little bit more, but it's so difficult to actually get that thing into position to fire multiple times that it's not even worth trying. If Tyrannifex has just had a better ballistic skill and shot more, just did generally more damage, I think they'd be okay. You could potentially see Rupture Cannon builds being good to kind of try to solve that toughness 8 problem that Tyranids have traditionally had. But without a rework to the datasheet, I don't know if that's on the table. Really, just the design of this unit is like totally flabbergasting to me. If you look at a Tyrannifex compared to how an Exocrine operates on the table, an Exocrine is a very laser-focused design that, moves, uses stratagem, stands still, shoots, rerolls its hits, gets +1, is entirely based around that mechanic of standing still and shooting and has a weapon that complements it, whereas the Tyrannifex just straight up doesn't. Poor Tyrannifex, I know they're a bit of a fan favorite, and I would like to see Tyrannifexes see play, but they definitely need some changes. And with that, we're moving on to the Thropes here. We'll talk about Venom Thropes first. They're very similar to a Malanthrope in the strengths and weaknesses of their ability. Unfortunately, it just doesn't work quite as well in 9th edition. Not only are you going to be splitting high fleets more often than not, but -1 effects are also significantly less powerful than they were. That said, if you are playing a list that you're worried about being alpha struck, and you want some additional layers of protection, I think Venom Thropes are a better option than the Malanthrope, not only because they don't eat an HQ slot, and Tyranid Elite slots tend to be wide open because we don't have any good ones, but they're also significantly less expensive. They can be targeted out, but that's not a huge issue unless your opponent already has indirect fire, and a lot of times if they have indirect fire, they're going to shoot at your Hive Guard anyway. A lot of indirect fire doesn't really reliably kill Venom Thropes. Their profile's just at a really awkward point to be killed by a lot of enemy artillery, and you have to kill all 3 of them to stop them affecting infantry with their auras. Killing just one of them makes them stop affecting monsters, but again, if you can put them in a relatively safe position and your opponent doesn't have like a perfect weapon profile to kill them, that's often very difficult. That means that on turn 1, they can be affecting, 2 or 3 monsters with -1 to hit, make your opponent's turn 1 targeting very difficult. So I do think we're going to put Venom Thropes probably top of C here, certainly better than a Malanthrope, but again, an archetype of unit you don't often see. And last, but certainly not least, in our Tyranid faction breakdown, let's talk about the Zoanthrope. Now, I talked about the Neurothrope's ability and how it actually doesn't really work in 9th edition earlier, and that downside does compound to Zoanthropes as well. Because the effectiveness of Zoanthropes is predicated on Neurothropes supporting them, not having access to that ability is a big downside. Now, there is a little bit of an upside, and actually this is a silver lining to some of the changes that were made in the January FAQ, namely the points increase that Zoanthropes got from 45 to 50, making a unit of 5 Zoanthropes, which is going to be the size of the unit basically every time you play with them, 250 points. Now, the reason that that's important is that it makes them more expensive than most of the other melee monster options in the Codex. So things like Scythed Heirodules and Hive Tyrants are all going to be less expensive than a Zoanthrope unit. That means that Zoanthropes are targetable as your Wow We Stand That We Fight target. And let me tell you, if there's a unit that your opponent does not have to be required to kill to deny you points, it is 15 wounds with a 3+ invulnerable save that can hide behind obscuring terrain and just support your army with psychic powers all game. I think Zoanthropes are very much kind of a middle-of-the-road unit for Tyranids. They mechanically don't function very well. They have an incredibly powerful smite, but it being a smite and not its own psychic power means that it reduces the effectiveness of all of your other smites, and sometimes your opponent just denies it and takes no damage. Imagine being able to deny the witch on a gun. You can't do that, so it's weird that you can do it to the only way that this unit ever deals any damage. That said, dealing all their damage in the Psychic phase actually gives them some interesting synergy with Swarmlord, given that you can just use this unit to jump out, cast a Psychic Stream, cast a Smite, try to debuff your opponents with Horror or Paroxysm, do all your Psychic chicanery in the Psychic phase, but chain the unit back to the Swarmlord, who then will just pull them back behind a line of sight blocker and keep them safe for that round. This is something that Swarmlord does with his Psychers quite a lot, and a really good synergy that he has with powerful Psyker units, and it works absolutely the best with these Zoanthropes. On top of that, keeping them safe means that they're a better While We Stand target, and if you can build your army around making those While We Stand targets very resilient, units like Hive Guard and Zoanthropes are hard to get to if your opponent doesn't have the right profiles. That can mean that you have access to a freebie secondary you can often score 10 to 15 points on every game. That's the one situation where I really like Zoanthropes. Other than that, I'm not sure I would take them, but if you're building your list around them, definitely a solid option. And that's it. That's every single Tyranid model. We went through all of them, all 49 data sheets in the Tyranid faction. Whew. I'm excited to have, I think, a pretty comprehensive tier list ranking for all of these Tyranids in the current 40k metagame. Let me know down in the comments if you agree with the list, if you have any other additions or changes that you would make in your own tier list. Obviously, a lot of this is subjective because it's very highly dependent on play skill. Obviously, a lot of this is subjective because it's very highly dependent on play style, so I would be happy to hear any suggestions that you might have. So I would be happy to hear any thoughts that you might have on this particular list. Anyway, that's going to be it for this video. Thanks for watching all the way to the end, all the way through this massive breakdown. Big thanks to my patrons over at patreon.com/tacticaltortoise, YouTube channel members. All those people are phenomenal. Twitch subscribers, everyone helps support me, helps me keep making the content that I do. I really appreciate them. And thanks again for watching all the way to the real end of the video. Remember to keep it classy and have happy wargaming.